whose early life story has been turned into a film called Killing Bono, which you can see on the 1st of April. Neil was at school with U2. This is Mount Temple Comprehensive in Dublin. What kind of a school was it?
It was a non-denominational school, which was very rare for Ireland in the 70s. It was the only one in Dublin. And it had a kind of progressive attitude, which was good. You know, it's a school where we were allowed to be in bands and practice in the music room, which was in itself, you know, a rarity. So it was a school that kind of facilitated the rise of U2, really.
Because it allowed, they had that environment where they could create.
Yeah. And you know, Ireland in the 70s was a strange place. I liken it to probably Britain in the 50s. And it was quite, you know, for all the gregariousness and loveliness of Ireland, and we know the wonderful characteristics of Ireland, it was a very repressive country in its own way. You know, religion was intensely tied in with the state. Alcoholism was rife, and poverty was fairly. We were the poorest country in Europe, and it looks like we're becoming that again. And you know, you left school and then you left the country. That was basically what you did, and it was really. It was hard to be in a band. You know, we were kind of the generation that opened up the band things. Before that, it was totally dominated by these things called show bands, who just went around wearing kind of brightly coloured uniforms and playing the hits and some country songs to farmers. There was nowhere to play, so there was a kind of market of pubs and stuff that was opened up by the punk generation. And you couldn't have imagined growing up then that a band could have gone on to sort of dominate the world like U2. And
when did you know they were good? Because you didn't like the name, but you liked the lads.
I knew they were good the first time I saw them.
Right.
And that was in the school gymnasium on some tables that had been put together, playing Peter Frampton's Show Me the Way and the Bay City Rollers song, which they always wish that I would forget. And say things like, but it was ironic. I said, we were 14, we didn't know what ironic meant. But you know, there was a moment, you know, they took off, the chord sort of sounded out, and Bono just grabbed the mic. He had a guitar then, but he stopped playing the guitar and he grabbed the microphone and started banging it on the ground and lifting it up and doing this, "I want you, show me the way." It was really exciting, and you kind of thought, wow, all right, this is a proper band. Same lineup, the exact same lineup, the same four people that are here.
Which is quite unusual in itself,
today.
isn't it?
It's really very, very unusual.
And what about you? Let's run through your bands then. We mentioned Frankie Corpse and the Undertakers. And then what about the Modulators?
So Modulators, well, you know, you can tell the Frankie Corpse was punk rock, and then moved to new wave and sort of mod, so the Modulators. And then we were when our kind of Beatles obsession was coming through, so we were kind of indie jangly,
right,
new wave Beatley band.
And was Shook Up the band that then had the most success?
You know, did was doing okay in Ireland, but we came over to the UK to sign a record deal and it fell through, which is the story of my life. Always on the cusp, and I did actually sign a deal with Shook Up then, which we formed, which was very much a power sort of Big Shoulders, Duran Duran type pop rock band of the 80s, very, very 80s. Although we hoped to have some substance. You know, I look back and cringe, as we often.
And so by this is what, early 80s when you tried to sign this deal in the UK, is it?
We came to London in 1983 with
So by this time, you two had an album out, haven't they?
Oh, they were streaking ahead of us. But you know, we always had this conversation about rock and pop. That Bono and me would argue about, and he was like, "We are a rock band," and I'd say, "But you know, pop music is where it's at, popular," and so I could never, you know, I sort of thought, well, they'll be a good little rock band and play the clubs, but you know, if you want to play Wembley Stadium, you've got to be playing music like Michael Jackson or Prince, and that's what we thought. We thought we were a pop band, and we'd leave them behind. I was probably a better theoretician of pop
than a practitioner.
And
you still record now, though, don't you? Is that right?
I occasionally do.
As the Ghost Who Walks.
I occasionally do. You know, to be honest, I try and keep it low profile, because the occasions when I have stuck my head above the parapet, I usually get shot off by my fellow critics.
But it's not easy to keep this low profile, is it? Because tell me whether these things are true, because you know what the internet's like. So it's true you record under the name The Ghost Who Walks.
Yes.
That's true. And Mel Gibson used your music on a soundtrack to Passion of the Christ. Was music inspired by?
This was the most amazing thing. I actually got called up by Mel Gibson's office saying, can we use your song on the Passion of the Christ?
2 or 3 years ago?
This was about 6 years ago. And it ended up, in the end, it didn't end up in the soundtrack because he decided to go with this Aramaic type soundtrack, but he put out an album of all the music he'd put together. And I'm there between Elvis Presley and Nick Cave with Leonard Cohen and Bob Dylan bringing up the rear, which is where I always imagined I would be. And in fact, you too have played one of my songs, or at least a snippet of one of my songs. On the Vertigo tour, they played it 8 times. And Bono used to say, I'm going to record that song. Unfortunately, he never did, so I didn't get to retire on the royalties. It was called People I Don't Know Are Trying to Kill Me. And it sort of suits him better than me, because there probably are people out there who'd like to see the end of him.
Elton John's a fan. Is this true?
Elton John is a fan of my book, and actually rang me up to say, well, first of all, he rang me up. I didn't even know him. The phone rang and it went, Neil, it's Elton. And you don't go, Elton who, do you?
No, yeah. You tend to think, it's not going to be Elton Wellesby, is it?
No. And he said it was the best book about pop music he'd ever read, which was lovely. And he said he would help me in any way that he could. So I said, well, you could put an album out on your label. But obviously he thought the book was better than the album.
I always think when people like that ring you up, that I always think it's my mates messing about. It hasn't happened very often to me.
You see, I'm probably egotistic enough to believe that Elton would ring me. Actually, in my job, I do get these. Paul McCartney rang me at home a couple of times, and my wife, I wasn't there, and my wife saying, Paul rang, and I'm like, Paul who?
Was he in the area offering you a quote for Windows?
He was ringing up to thank me for something I'd written. So, I'm in contact with these people. People know how to get hold of me.
You managed to get yourself into that gig at the 100 Club, didn't you? That Paul did?
I did. That was amazing.
How was it? I was at the Apollo the following night.
Yeah. It was, to see him in that environment without a big staging or anything, just playing a proper, Scouse rock and roll, was absolutely amazing. And his voice got much thinner, but it didn't matter. It was very, very live.
And it was kind of I saw some pictures of it. I think, he can do any kind of setup. I was at Hyde Park last year to see him do that. He can do any setup. He can do that big stadium in the middle of a field thing, or he can do...
He is...
one of the things that struck me, I don't know if you noticed this, Neil. I've seen him 3 or 4 times now in the last year. I've noticed that he comes on stage, he plays for 3 hours. Not once does he take a drink of water, a drink of anything. There's no fluid goes down his throat. And I was thinking, how's he managing that? I'm drinking all the time when I'm broadcasting. Not alcohol, obviously. Although you might beg to differ when you hear the content. But I just thought, that's incredible. Is that because those guys started off by playing 6-hour sets in Hamburg, and so 3 hours to him is nothing?
Possibly. Maybe he's got a catheter.
But it is incredible, isn't it? There's hardly any breaks between songs. And you're lucky to get an hour and a half out of it. We start to sound like Statler and Waldorf now, but you are lucky to get an hour and a half from a modern band, aren't you?
There's a proper rock and roll legend that playing the Hamburg gigs, the nightly 12 hours of non-stop rock and roll, that's where you learn to play like that. Very few British bands, there is no circuit for British bands to learn to play like that. So what you have now is somebody suddenly turns around and says, we love the Vaccines, who've played 8 gigs, and and they've got a certain vibe about them. But in America, where it's a much bigger country, there's a bigger circuit, American bands can always really play because they've played 105 gigs before they made a ripple in the local.
Keith Richards told me when we interviewed the Rolling Stones for 5 Live that they only discovered drugs because of 12-hour sets, because they were playing these sets in these clubs, and they were saying to the musicians, we're exhausted, how do you keep going? And he said, the one guy turned to him and he said, Cat, try this.
I've got a feeling Keith would have found the drugs.
Wherever.
One of my great moments as a rock critic was spending 2 days with Keith Richards, when he basically didn't let me out of his sight, and something was keeping him up, which he wasn't sharing around. And we drove around in this limo listening to... It was a Motown station on the radio, and he didn't want to get out of the limo, and he was just telling me about every single song. He had in that limo, I remember, a bottle of champagne, a bottle of Jack Daniels, a bottle of vodka, and a bunch of bananas. and Motown Radio. That was all he needed to keep him going for 2 nights.
That's brilliant, isn't it? Alex, I was the lead singer in a band around 14 years ago which played covers, most of which were U2 songs. Our second gig was in a huge nightclub in front of several hundred people. The first set was great, but at the interval, my 3 pints of lager was spiked with several vodkas, and the second set was so bad we split up on the spot. Ratman in Bristol. Sorry, Yom the Ratman. In 1980, my last year at school, my friend had a thrash punk band called Condemned Youth. I was invited to become the vocalist. I took the lyric book home. It was a school exercise book with his life's work written in it. My dad found it and destroyed it, muttering something like, "I will not have profanities of this nature in our house." That was the week before our debut at the Ashton Court Festival. I was kicked out and the band split up there and then. Who knows, those lyrics could have been priceless. We like these stories from you, please. How your band split up. 85058. You can email phil@bbc.co.uk, and we'll chat some more with Neil after Justine Green at 2:30.
Online at bbc.co.uk/5live.
This is BBC Radio 5 Live.